So I'll make one last one. So, this was the freaking the Ship of Theseus and how that relates to the Go and Marry. And a lot of people are probably already gone over this, but I've noticed that nobody's used the term intersubjective, and the AI came with that, and I actually criticized it. I was like, that's not going deep enough. So maybe there's actually it's worth making another video on this topic. So anyway, the Ship of Theseus briefly. The classical paradox is if you replace every ship, a single plank of a ship over time, is it still the same ship? It's really a question about identity through change. What makes a thing that thing rather than something else? There are two broad camps. Materialists say identity is tied to physical continuity. Once every plank is replaced, you have a new ship. The original is gone. Essentialists or functionalists say identity is tied to something less tangible, the form, the purpose, the soul of the thing. The ship remains itself as long as it fulfills its essential role or carries its essential character. Most philosophical traditions land somewhere in between, which is exactly what makes this paradox so sticky. Now, the Going Merry. Here's where Oda does something quietly brilliant. The Going Merry isn't just a vehicle, she's a crew member, and her arc is essentially a staged engagement with both sides of the paradox, arriving at a third answer that feels distinctly Japanese and distinctly Oda's own. The materialist case plays out visibly. The Mary is patched, rebuilt, repaired, and at Eni's lobby, she has been so extensively modified that almost nothing original remains in her hull. By any strict materialist reading, she should already be a different ship. Iceberg, the master shipwright, tells the crew as such. She is beyond saving, structurally finished. But then Oda introduces the klabautermann. In real nautical folklore, the klabautermann is a spirit ship. Is a ship spirit. Wow. A being that inhabits a vessel that has been loved and cared for. The Mary's spirit has been tending to the ship in secret, making repairs no one could account for. Most famously, keeping her together long enough to sail to Eni's lobby after she was deemed dead. This is Oda essentially arguing the essentialist position in a visual narrative form. The soul of the ship persisted independent of the material. And here's the twist that makes it feel like a personal philosophical statement rather than a plot device. Oda's third answer, love as the continuity principle. Most treatments of the Ship of Theseus focus on the ship itself as the unit of identity. Oda quietly shifts the frame. The Going Mary's identity, her soul, her continued existence is maintained not by her planks, not even by her abstract form, but by the love directed at her by the crew. Think about the progression. Usopp is the one who repairs her the most devoutly, talks to her, treats her as a being with feelings when he leaves the crew in Water 7, partly because he can't bear to admit she needs to be let go. The Mary essentially holds herself together one last time to come get them. The ship's will to persist mirrors the emotional bonds attached to her. This means Oda is proposing something closer to what philosophers sometimes call a relational theory of identity. The thing is what is because of the relationship that constitutes it. The Mary is the Going Mary because she is their Going Mary. The ship's the Luffy's crew loved, repaired imperfectly, and sailed across the first half of the Grand Line on. And when those relationships are finally tearfully acknowledged as complete, she can die. The funeral scene is philosophical resolution. The Viking funeral at the end of Eni's lobby is where Oda crystallizes all of this. Rather than the Mary simply sinking or being scrapped, which would be the materialist ending. She is ceremoniously released. The crew weeps. She speaks. She thanks them. But what Oda is saying is that the Ship of Theseus paradox is the wrong question. Asking is it the same ship treats identity as property the ship possesses on its own. The Going Mary's arc suggests that identity, at least for someone loved, is intersubjective. It exists between the ship and the people who cared for her, and that's kind of identity doesn't erode with planks. It ends with the relation. It ends when the relationship ends, which is why the only way to let it go was with grief and gratitude, not a shipwright's judgment. It's also worth noting that this is deeply resonant with Japanese animist traditions. The Shinto concept of kami, inhabiting objects that are deeply cared for, and the practice of looks like kyo. Uh, I don't know. I don't know that one. I'll have to look up that one. Memorial service. Yeah, it's a memorial service. I definitely have to look up that one. Held for worn out objects. Oh, that's interesting. I'm learning something that I just glazed over when I already did this. Learning while I'm doing it live. Oh my goodness, that's awesome. Anyway, uh, Oda likely didn't need to consciously think, I will now address this the Ship of Theseus. He may have been drawing on intuitions that happen to map onto the paradox very precisely. The result is one of the most emotionally sophisticated pieces of philosophy in storytelling and manga. Not a lecture, but a lived argument made through tears on a burning ship. Basically, it was responding saying that, your term intersubjectivity sounds, just a little myopic for my standards. Like, wouldn't transjective like fit a little bit more? Like, okay, like you're going for more that angle. I'm gonna go from more the Vervaeke cognitive science angle. Like we could mash up a little both, but like this is my perspective, right? And I was basically saying that it felt respectfully. Your response felt like it was suffering a little bit from the intuification, like everything today. As I clicked use style explanatory, and your response was the Ship of Theseus briefly, and it did say that. I read that, and when I click use style explanatory, I expect more expanded upon responses, and it responds. That's a genuinely sharp pushback, and you're right in both counts. Let me address the conceptual point first, because it's worth sitting with. Then I'll give you the expansive treatment it deserves. You're correct that transjectivity is more precise framing here than intersubjectivity. Intersubjectivity describes a shared understanding of meaning or meaning that exists between subjects, two people who both recognize the same thing. It still keeps the identity of the object question somewhat bracketed. Transjectivity, as developed in thinkers like Gilbert Simondon and later carried forward in object-oriented and relational ontology. I'm gonna have to look up this Gilbert guy too, or girl, whoever, or in between, or in neither the above, or whatever. Anyway, and later carried forward in object-oriented and relational ontology goes further. It describes how meaning, identity, and even being emerge through relation, not merely alongside it. The subject and object co-constitute each other across the relationship or relation. The Going Merry isn't just recognized as meaningful by the crew. She becomes who she is through the ongoing transactive process of being loved, repaired, sailed, grieved. Her soul isn't a property she has. It's something that crystallized out of that transjectivity. That's a more radical and more accurate claim, and I should have named it properly. Now let me do justice to the full argument. Setting the stage, why the Ship of Theseus matters at all. To appreciate what Oda is doing, you first need to feel the full weight of the original paradox, because it isn't just a cute brain teaser. It cuts to the heart of one of the oldest and most unresolved questions in philosophy. What makes anything the thing that it is across time? The myth that goes that the Athenians preserved the ship that Theseus sailed on his legendary voyage, replacing planks as they rotted out. Eventually, every single original piece of timber had been swapped out. The questions the Athenians themselves reportedly debated was, is this still Theseus's ship? If you collected all the old planks and reassembled them elsewhere, that would have a stronger claim to material continuity, but it wouldn't really be the ship in the harbor, the one people have maintained and venerated. So which one is really Theseus's ship? The reason this question has survived millennia of philosophy is that it forces you to commit to a theory of identity, a theory of you reach for that has uncomfortable consequences. If you say identity is material continuity, that a thing is itself because it consists of the same stuff, then you run into the problem that your own body nearly replaces all of its atoms over the course of several years. Yeah, right? I've thought of that one before, right? By that logic, you are not the same person you were as a child, which feels deeply wrong. We carry memory, personality, relationship, and a continuous subjective experience across the material change. Surely that matters. Yeah, it matters to the ego. I don't know. Anyway, if you say identity is formal or functional continuity, that a thing is itself because it remains its structure, its purpose, its essence, then you have to explain what that essence actually is and where it lives. A ship whose every plank is replaced still has the same shape and still sails, but a ship-shaped object made of an entirely different material that fulfills the same function is that same ship, is that the same ship or just a perfect replica? The form seems too thin a criteria on its own. So if you try psychological continuity as Locke did for persons anchoring identity and memory, that works reasonably well for conscious things but struggles with objects. Ships don't remember anything, or do they? This is where things get very interesting and where Oda comes in. What Oda builds before he tears it down. Oda spends roughly the entire first half of One Piece, from Shell's Town to Water 7, slowly, almost imperceptually making the Going Merry a character. That is not accidental, it's preparatory philosophical work. He needs you to feel, before the argument begins, that the ship is a being, not just a vehicle. He does this through small gestures. The crew names her, decorates her, argues on her, sleeps on her deck. Usopp repairs her obsessively and personally, treating it as an act of devotion rather than maintenance. There are quiet moments where the camera lingers on her figurehead, the sheep at the bow, as if she's watching. When the crew is separated or endangered, the Mary is often framed as waiting, almost anxiously. None of this is plot critical, all of it is characterization. By the time the crew arrives at Water 7, you have absorbed emotionally and intuitively that the Mary is a someone. This matters because the upcoming philosophical argument will only land if you have accepted its premise at gut level. Oda is seeding the conclusion before he poses the question. Water 7 as the materialist argument. Water 7, in philosophical terms, the materialist case made in the strongest possible form. Iceberg and the master shipwrights examine the Going Merry and deliver the verdict. The cold authority of expertise. She is structurally finished. The keel, the spine of the ship, the single most fundamental element of a vessel's structural identity, is cracked beyond repair. Not patched over, not weakened, cracked. She cannot be saved. This is not a villain's claim. Iceberg is not wrong. He's arguably the most qualified person in the world to make this assessment, and Oda makes sure we understand that. The materialist position is given its fullest, most credible voice here. The physical substrate has failed, and therefore the ship is over. Usopp's insistence that she can be repaired is framed heartbreakingly, as a form of denial, the refusal of a grieving person to accept loss. And then Oda does something that reframes the entire debate. While the crew is in Water 7 arguing about whether to get a new ship, the Going Merry, abandoned in the harbor, alone, makes repairs to herself. Not metaphorically, physically, rope is tied. I'm pretty sure it was repairing itself at Sky Island, but yeah. Rope is tied, planks are adjusted, she's found seaworthy, she's found when she should have been dead in the water. The shipwrights are baffled, the crew is baffled, and then Oda introduces the klabautermann. The klabautermann, and the soul that outlives the body. In Northern European seafaring folklore, the klabautermann is a small spirit, someone sometimes described as resembling a sailor, that inhabits a ship which has been genuinely cared for. It is not a ghost of someone who died aboard, it is the ship's own animating spirit, drawn into being by the love and attention directed by the vessel. Sailors consider encountering the klabautermann. I'm not going to treat this with 100% I'm not going to take this 100% truthful, because I haven't looked up that klabautermann article on Wiki yet, or anywhere things on the klabautermann really. So I'm not going to take that entirely true, but on what it's saying right here, because it could be Oda's take, drawn into the text of what the AI is getting here. But I don't know either way. So, but anyway. It's not a ghost of someone who dies, the ship's own animating spirit. Sailors considered encountering the klabautermann to be both a blessing and an omen. A blessing because it meant the ship was truly alive and protecting the crew, an omen because it typically appeared when the ship was near the end of her life. Oda knew this folklore precisely, and he knew it with precision. The Going Merry's klabautermann appears small, gentle, wearing the same pattern as Mary's sails, and see, that's where it's saying things. I feel like it's hallucinating a little bit. I'm like, I remember the klabautermann of Mary at Sky Island or whatever, and it was like gray and sort of see-through and like all that mist, it wasn't really, you're not able to make out a lot, it's basically just like a transparent silhouette. Yeah, but anyway, he uses the klabautermann appears. The spirit has been tending the body even as the body failed. What this does philosophically is split the question of identity into two levels. At the material level, the ship is dying and cannot be saved. Iceberg is right, but at another level, at another level, the shipwrights have no instruments to measure. The ship is very much alive and has been actively sustaining herself. Oda is not dismissing the materialist position. He's accepting it as true in its own terms while arguing that there's another level of reality which it doesn't tell the whole story. This is a move that often parallels in philosophy of mind. Materialists who study consciousness often accept that the brain is just neurons and electrochemical signals, and then wrestle with the hard problem of why there is subjective experience at all, why it feels like something to be conscious. The materialist facts don't seem to add up to the phenomenal facts. Oda is making an analogous argument about the ship. The timber facts don't add up to the being of the Mary facts. The Enies lobby moment and what it actually argues. Here's where the plot does its deepest philosophical lifting. The going Mary, structurally dead, lifts her sail. Structurally dead, sails herself to Enies lobby to rescue the crew. At the exact moment, all hope seems lost. By any materialist accounting, this is impossible. But the klabautermann's love, the ship's own will, grown from the crew's devotion, and then becomes autonomous, overrides the material verdict. She sails on spirit alone. This is not presented as magic in the usual sense. It's presented as something that makes complete sense once you accept that Mary is a being whose continuity isn't grounded in her timber. She persists by herself as the going Mary, loyal companion of the Straw Hats, not because her whole is intact, but because the identity constituted through years of relationship and care had its own momentum, its own will to complete the journey. And this is crucial, she cannot sail forever on that alone. When the crew is safe, she finally begins to sink. The body was always going to fail. Oda doesn't let the soul argument become a cheap escape from the material reality. The paradox isn't dissolved, it's honored. The two levels of identity are both real, and the tragedy is precisely that the material level eventually makes its claim regardless. Transjectivity, the real philosophical frame. Now here's where your correction is essential and where the argument becomes most interesting. Saying that the Mary has a soul that the crew recognizes is still subtle framing that the ship has an independent entity that the crew is an independent entity that the crew merely perceives. That is not quite what Oda shows us at all. What Oda actually depicts is something closer to what Simondon calls transindividuation, a process in which individuation, a process of becoming a self or of an entity, the becoming of. I'm gonna repeat that, man. That was a mess. That was like the biggest mess I've ever recorded. Like, pardon that verbal vomit. Like, that was just ugh. So, let's start that all over again right there. So, transjectivity, the real philosophical frame. Now here is where your correction is essential and where the argument becomes most interesting. Saying that the Mary has a soul that the crew recognizes is still subtly framing the ship as an independent entity that the crew merely perceives. That's not quite what Oda shows us. What Oda actually depicts is something closer to what Simondon calls transindividuation, a process in which individuation, the becoming a self or of an entity, of any entity. That's, man, they're putting too many damn frickin' italics and punctuation and this and that, and man, I'm not that frickin' formal with my frickin' educational background, AI. I'm a frickin' autodidact, man. Yeah, come on, give me a little bit of a break. So, okay, what Oda actually depicts is something closer to, it's like the third time doing it, but fuck it. So what Oda actually depicts is something closer to what Simondon called transindividuation, a process in which individuation, the becoming a self of any entity, doesn't happen within an individual, but between and across individuals in relation. The Going Merry's soul didn't pre-exist the voyage and get discovered by the crew. It crystallized through the accumulated transactions of care, repair, conflict, grief, and use. Usopp's hands on her planks, Luffy's laughter on her deck, Nami's navigation from her helm, all of this wasn't just the crew using the Mary. It was the crew and the ship co-constituting each other's identities in an ongoing transactive process. This is what transjectivity names. The relational is not between two preformed entities. The relation is generative. It produces the entities as the kind of entities they are. The Going Merry is the Going Merry because she emerged through that particular crossing with those particular people, and their identities as the Straw Hat crew are equally bound up with having crossed the first half of the Grand Line on her. Separate them and both are diminished, not just emotionally, ontologically. This is why the farewell scene is so metaphysically precise. It's not just sad, it is the formal dissolution of the constitutive relation. The Mary thanks the crew weeps. She isn't just dying. The relation that made her her is being consciously, ceremonially closed. Oda frames it as a mutual release. She lets them go, they let her go, because the transjectivity that generated both parties is coming to its end. The Viking funeral seals this. Fire is not merely destruction in this context. Fire is transformation, completion, release. The Mary doesn't just sink and rot, she is ended properly, which means the relation to is honored in its ending with the same care it was honored during its living. This is why Usopp's return to the crew shortly after feels thematically right. His arc and the Mary's arc are entangled. His inability to let her go delayed both dissolutions. When he rejoins, it's as someone who has grieved honestly and completed the relation. That is exactly what the crew did with the ship herself. The deeper Oda intuition, Mono no aware, and Shinto animism. I'm aware of Shinto animism, but I've never heard of Mono no aware, so I've got some new things to look up. You know? Underneath all of this, it's worth naming the cultural streams Oda is drawing from, because they quietly inform why he reaches from this particular resolution rather than a purely Western philosophical one. The Shinto tradition holds that the kami, spirits, presence, animating forces can inhabit objects that are tended with care and sincerity. This isn't just superstition. It's a coherent ontological stance that the boundary between the inanimate and the animate are not fixed, and that care and attention can genuinely bring something into a fuller mode of being. The klabautermann is a Western folklore parallel, but Oda would have had deep cultural intuitions about object spirit from his own context that made the idea feel natural rather than imported. And then there's Mono no aware, the Japanese aesthetic and philosophical sensibility of bittersweet sensitivity to transience, the pathos of things. It's not mere sadness or permanence, it's the recognition of the beauty of something and the fact of its passing are inseparable. Yeah, I understand that one completely as a trans dualist. I fucking vibe with change, man. I live for change, man. It's the change. It's the, I'm like the South Park homeless, man. Like I don't need spiritual substance. Just give me the change. That is the spiritual substance. I'm not talking fiscal change. I'm talking the metaphysical, physical, all that real change. Yeah. So, all right, back to the mono nowhere. So the mono nowhere, the Japanese aesthetic and philosophical sensibility of the sensitivity to transience, the pathos of things, the impermanence is the recognition of the beauty of something and the fact of its passing are inseparable. That is the poignancy. I am too tired for this. I am out like a light bulb after this. The Going Merry arc is perhaps the single most perfectly realized instance of mono no aware in all of manga. Her death isn't a tragedy to be overcome, it's the completion of something beautiful, and that the tears are appropriate and honorable response to beauty that has run its course. What Oda arrives at, drawing on all of this, is something no single Western philosophical tradition quite captures on its own. That identity is real, that it can outlast material decay, that it is generated through transjectivity rather than given in advance, and that its ending should be met with grief that is also gratitude. The Ship of Theseus paradox in this light was always asking the wrong question, not because identity doesn't matter, but because it treated identity as a property, an object has in isolation. When the Mary shows us it is something that happens between beings in time. So, that was just my little take, because I instantly, was not a philosopher, I was just, who's read some basics and stuff and, come up with my own theories, bounced all around, Yeah, you can damn well tell me, like, my old freaking, like, 10, 20 years ago self, just memory full on latching. Yeah, I remember looking at that Wikipedia in like 2000 freaking 9 or something. I don't know. Like, yeah, I've seen that. And I bounced back to that page a few times. When you bounce back to pages, whether it's a page in a book that you like a quote, or a page on Wikipedia that you find especially interesting, it tends to solidify in your memory a little bit. But anyway, that was my little bit on the Ship of Theseus paradox and how it relates to, the Going Merry and Oda's own take on it and my take, and just, I don't know. So anyway, this has been Sage DeForest at this has been Sage DeForest at Saged and Confused, signing out and knocking the hell out, because apparently I need it, because my English don't no work no more. What the fuck? For reals, man. I'm just blah, 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 blah. Speak no evil is something. I don't know. Anyway, peace.